Towards the end of the tumultuous decade of the 1960s, university campuses across the nation became the nesting grounds of social change. Students marched, protested, and even formed organizations of their own, taking a stand for black power, civil rights, and the anti-war movement. The resulting opposition from the authorities did not silence the voices of these uprisers, but rather fueled and legitimized the resistance, making way for more and more protest and change. Thus emerged what became known as the New Left.
Columbia in 1968 was an opportunity for people like me who were students. I was a law student who had come from a fairly comfortable family to think about the fact that our comfort and our lavish education was going on in our part of the world, while in Vietnam, on the other side of the world, hundreds of thousands of people were being killed every year. Land was being destroyed by our government in our name. You could only coexist with those two things in your mind at the same time for so long.
Morningside Park in New York City is a long, narrow strip of greenery, beautiful stonework, and playgrounds stretching from 110th Street to 123rd Street in the heart of West Harlem. Just down the block sits Columbia University, the Ivy League institution and center for higher learning and intellectual enrichment, home to thousands of the world's brightest and most privileged young minds. In 1968, Columbia set out to construct a 6-story gymnasium in the nearby Morningside Park. The decision met with immediate opposition.
But I don't think a gym 9 stories high with facilities for black people in the basement with a back door is something that black people want.
There has never been any dispute as to the position of this community on the placing of a gymnasium by a private institution in a public park.
Simultaneously, the university was and had been receiving funding from the Institute for Defense Analysis, thus supporting the Vietnam War and feeding the hard work of its students to the government and the war effort without consent.
The university now has become, to use an old term, a means of production, whereby one guy does a little bit for IDA, another little bit for CIA. And this university is now a means of production producing the mechanisms of human oppression. It's been bought out by the military. 50% of the research done here at this university depends on defense money.
And we can see when we look at the new buildings that are going up, we can tell how much this university is hooked into servicing the corporations and hooked into servicing the war machine.
Tensions among both students and the Harlem community over the university's controversial gym project, its involvement with the IDA, and its president, Grayson Kirk's ban on peaceful demonstrations in university buildings had risen to such an extreme that it seemed necessary to take action.
On April 23rd, SDS called a demonstration in which we planned to demonstrate inside Low Library to protest Columbia's complicity with the Institute for Defense Analysis, its racism in building the gym in Morningside Park, and its attempted suppression of the left by disciplining 6 students. About 500 people joined us at the Sundial. We were opposed by about 200 jocks. We found that not only were the jocks there blocking our way, but we found when we got to Low Library that the library was locked by the administration.
I must have thought that would stop us, but it didn't. As we went into Harlem, we busted into the gym side.
The pigs called in reinforcements.
I spoke with Eleanor Steen, who was earning her graduate degree in law at Columbia in the late 60s. Her involvement in the protest and her subsequent arrest led her to join the SDS and the radical New Left organization Weatherman the following year.
On the first day, what became the first day of those days, April 23rd, I was in class with my friends, Michael Ratner, Karen's husband, and others, Gus Reichbeck, and we could hear the chanting through the window of the march. We knew that it was going to happen, so we just kind of slipped out the back of the class and joined the march, and we walked over to the site of the gym, and the SDS people were sitting down and tearing down the construction fences around the site and generally trying to make it kind of physically impossible for the construction work to go ahead. So we kind of joined the march. I joined the march, and then the SDS people led people over back onto the campus because there was nothing much more to do at the construction site. we were standing out front of Hamilton Hall, which is a classroom building, and someone suggested, why don't we go in and take over the building?
The two factions of protesters, white students led by the SDS and black students led by the Society of Afro-American Students, gathered in the lobby of Hamilton Hall, discussing their next move.
The students went into all the classrooms, told people to leave, told the faculty members to leave, and then they barricaded the door, so they made it impossible for other people to come in. In the course of that, the African-American students eventually, I think it was by the next morning, they decided that they wanted to make that their kind of spot.
The real thing about the black-white split was that the two groups realized that we had two different political identities. The blacks wanted to stop the gym. They figured the best way to do this was to hold the building, barricade it. The whites, on the other hand, saw and still see that our goal is to radicalize other white people. We didn't want to confront other students coming to class. We thought that we should confront our enemy, the administration. But we didn't realize that we were much too timid, and that what we really had to do was to show our moral strength and hold the building. Now the blacks saw that we were split amongst ourselves, that we weren't disciplined, and that we really didn't understand what the correct militant tactic was. So they asked us to leave.
The white students left, and then we formed a barricade, or like a cordon sanitaire, around the building to prevent the police or the administration from trying to get the black students out. Then we took over the other building.
After being evicted from Hamilton Hall on the morning of April 24th, the white student protesters staked their claim in 4 other university buildings: Avery, Fayerweather, the Mathematics Building, and Low Library. They even managed to break into President Kirk's private office, sip his brandy, and smoke his cigars.
The first thing we did when we got into Kirk's office was hit his files. Besides a bunch of crap in his girly magazines, we found a bunch of papers linking Columbia to the IDA, a whole bunch of shit about putting down SDS, and a lot of letters about cleaning up the area by moving out the blacks and the Puerto Ricans.
Meanwhile, the black students occupying Hamilton developed an organized and disciplined community that differed sharply from the more boisterous atmosphere of the buildings occupied by the whites. Still, despite their less radical behavior, the black-occupied building appeared a time bomb to the panicked administration. Kirk, Truman, and the trustees feared that the forcible removal of the students in Hamilton would generate a violent reaction from the nearby Harlem community. Despite their differences, the black and white protesters adopted a common set of demands to unify and strengthen the movement. In short, they demanded that the gym project stop immediately, ties with the IDA be severed, and amnesty be granted to all of the students occupying the buildings. The administration eventually met the former two demands, but had no intention of pardoning what they felt to be illegal behavior. On the morning of Tuesday, April 30th, the administration called in the police. The bust began at 2 a.m. when police peacefully removed the black students from Hamilton Hall. Collectively, they chose not to resist arrest and exited campus relatively safely through its intricate system of underground tunnels. Only 86 of the hundreds of African Americans were arrested. The police used these same tunnels to break into the other occupied buildings and were met with far more resistance from the white students. Protesters were beaten with clubs and dragged by their hair, but the week-long occupation had empowered them. They were galvanized and prepared to put up a fight. By 4 a.m., over 700 arrests had been made. Columbia's biggest mistake in this whole affair may well have been waiting so long to call in the authorities. The strict administration allowed the protests to persist an entire week because of their refusal to meet the demands of the protesters. Perhaps a more communicative and tolerant approach would have resulted in less chaos and controversy. Ultimately, Columbia's stubborn and unforgiving stance on the student protests taking place on campus that resulted in hundreds of arrests and wrongful convictions demonstrate that by failing to honor and respect the democratic right to protest, Columbia radicalized its student body and unintentionally fostered an environment of politically extreme youth.
In that era, many, many hundreds of thousands of Americans felt that we had to take a stand. Each action leads to the next one. Going to a picket line, holding a sign on a street, or going to a demonstration with a pussy hat on. Each step leads you to feel more and more courageous and more that doing these things in a group of people can have an effect, and that you can affect history by taking a stand, but you can never affect history any other way.